In a dynamic city where success was measured by reputation and status, Malik Daira was a discreet but ambitious man. Born into a modest family, he grew up in a neighborhood where you learn to fight for every opportunity, where you are constantly confronted with challenges linked to social origin and skin color. His father, a local factory worker, and his mother, a dedicated teacher, had instilled in him values of integrity and hard work. What could have been an obstacle in a world where the elite was often defined by hereditary privileges and closed networks, Malik turned it into a strength. His success was the result of his keen intelligence, his ability to anticipate changes and push the limits. When he was still a young student, he had learned to deal with doubtful looks, the systematic invisibility of black people in circles of power. He knew his skin was a barrier for some, but he refused to see it as a limitation. Rather, he made it a driving force of his determination. He excelled in his studies, and through perseverance, he distinguished himself through his career. A graduate of a major engineering school, Malik had been spotted by a rapidly expanding multinational, a field where few people from his background or color had had the chance to get involved. Its innovative projects in sustainable development and social engineering had attracted the attention of numerous investors and decision-makers. Within a few years, Malik had moved up the ranks, and he now held a position as regional director in a leading company on the international market. A prestigious position, but also a role in a world where expectations were greater, eyes more scrutinizing. Every decision, every move of his was observed with a mixture of skepticism and wonder. Many thought that a man of his color had no place at this level, but he proved every day that competence was not measured by appearance. That morning, Malik was on his way to a crucial job interview. Not for any position, but for a key position that the company had just opened in a new branch abroad. The opportunity was one he had been waiting for a long time. A position as executive director for the company's expansion in a region where the stakes were both economic and geopolitical. This role would mark the peak of his career. He was nervous, of course, but also excited by the idea of being able to take the company in a new direction while breaking down even more barriers in an environment narrowed by fixed mindsets. In his head, Malik went over the questions he would be asked, the elements of his background he would highlight, and how he could demonstrate that he was the man they needed. Little did he know, however, how this interview would change his career and brutally expose the deeply rooted prejudices in the business world. It was not only an opportunity to shine, but also a test of the values he defended and the system in which he operated. Arriving at the company's ultramodern offices, Malik immediately felt the cold and distant atmosphere that reigned in this temple of capitalism and apparent perfection. The smooth, almost soulless white walls seemed disproportionately large, giving the impression that the grandeur of the company was more important than its employees. The decor, almost oppressively elegant and luxurious, was meticulous down to the smallest detail. Crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, thick deep red carpets covering the floor, glass desks overlooked by panoramic views. Every corner exuded prestige, but in this sanitized and impersonal world, Malik felt, for the first time in a long time, like an outsider. The interview was led by the Director of Human Resources, Ms. Claire Leroy, a woman in her 50s, with piercing eyes, dressed in an impeccable suit and a strict hairstyle that left no room for carelessness. She exuded an aura of authority, an imposing figure, respected and feared in the company. Her reputation was that of a rigid, demanding professional, almost inflexible in her judgments. In her eyes, efficiency and discipline were essential, and she never left room for exception or flexibility. Her management style was ironclad, and she expected every detail to be perfect, each candidate meeting criteria that she themselves considered intangible, often dictated by social norms that she deemed acceptable to the company's elites. From the start of the interview, Malik felt that something was wrong. He was not treated like the other candidates. He could feel the difference, subtle but very present, in every gesture, every word spoken. His responses, as precise and thoughtful as they were listened to with a certain detachment, as if they were not entirely worthy of attention. His qualifications, which he had meticulously presented, seemed to vanish in the cold air of the room. A feeling of invisibility weighed on him. He felt this palpable distance, like an invisible wall, which separated him not only from Madame Leroy, but from the opportunity itself. He knew that the color of his skin, even if it was never explicitly mentioned, was the obstacle that had been decided to place between him and this chance that he had so coveted. Ms. Leroy's questions, although polite and formal, lacked depth. Rather than focusing on his past projects, his ideas, or his vision for the future of the company, she focused on trivial subjects. His appearance, the way he planned to integrate into the team, his salary expectations, as if his price was a more determining factor than his expertise. Each question seemed like a test that he had to answer not with professionalism, but with an ability to conform to an image she already had in mind of him. He felt it deeply. His answers, despite their relevance and clarity, never seemed to resonate with her. She remained impassive, as if her qualifications didn't matter. If she responded, it was with distracted murmurs, as if her mind was already elsewhere, on something that had nothing to do with the interview. The way she dwelled on his outfit, on his gestures, on every superficial detail reinforced the impression that he was being judged on external criteria, on his appearance, rather than on his merit. The lingering feeling that his skin color, his accent, or even the way he carried himself were being observed with latent skepticism, establishing the opinion that he did not fit the image of the corporate elite. Then, after a few minutes, the decisive question fell, definitively shattering the illusion of a fair interview, the veil of courtesy that masked the true intentions. "You have a lot of experience, Mr. Diarra, but, how can I put it? You don't really seem to fit what we're looking for. Your profile is interesting, but I think we will have to continue the search for this position." Malik, although deeply injured, remained calm. The echo of his words resounded in his mind, like a stab to his self-esteem. It wasn't his skill that was in question, he knew that now. He was not rejected because of his lack of qualifications or his experience, but because of the image that Ms. Leroy had of him, the image of a black candidate in a closed world of white elites, a world where he did not seem to have his place. This insidious conviction, rooted in prejudices and fear of others, dictated his decision. He took a deep breath and slowly stood up. His hands were shaking slightly, not from nervousness, but from suppressed anger, from frustration with a system that had already judged him before he even had the opportunity to prove his worth. But before leaving the room, he stopped for a moment, a clear idea in mind. He turned slowly to Madame Leroy, fixing her with a calm but intense gaze, a glimmer of assurance that contrasted with the coldness of the situation. "Ms. Leroy, before you make that decision, let me tell you something," he began, his voice firm but respectful. "I think you are not aware of who I really am." Mrs. Leroy, visibly surprised by this interruption, raised an eyebrow, her gaze hardening slightly as she tried to understand what had just happened. "Pardon," she replied sharply, her face marked with disbelief. It was clear that she was not used to this kind of questioning. But Malik, without letting himself be deterred by the director's apparent confusion, kept his calm and stood up straighter. He felt the weight of the moment settle on him, a rare opportunity to confront the reality of prejudice directly and bluntly. His hands were slightly clenched, but his voice remained firm, almost cold, in perfect contrast to the inner turmoil he felt. In a calm tone, but with an authority that instantly perceived the icy facade of the company, he let slip the truth that would rock Ms. Leroy's world. "I am here today to meet you, because I am the one who will supervise you, Ms. Leroy." He paused briefly, letting his words sink into the director's mind, before continuing, with measured precision. "The position you have just refused me is not a simple formality for me. This is a decisive step in the mission that I have already accepted with the agreement of the board of directors. I will oversee the expansion of this company throughout the region, and I cannot allow my qualifications to be overlooked because of your tunnel vision." Malik's words fell into the room like a clap of thunder, echoing throughout the cold, luxurious space. A heavy silence followed, almost palpable. He could see the immediate transformation in Ms. Leroy's face, which suddenly paled, her mask of professionalism cracking to give way to confusion, then embarrassment. Her hands shook slightly as she seemed to search for an answer. She stood up quickly, as if she had just realized that she had crossed an invisible line. She tried to regain her composure, but it was already too late. The shock was too deep, too raw. Malik's gaze, direct and unwavering, hit her hard. "I'm sorry, I didn't know," she stammered, her words mixed together in a clumsy attempt to apologize, but nothing could erase the depth of her mistake. But the excuses were in vain. Malik knew this, and in the back of his mind, he felt a deep bitterness about this situation. Even if she felt guilty, it wouldn't change the experience he had just had. This humiliation, this silent rejection, was the daily experience of many black men and women in similar positions. This was not an isolated incident. It was just one example of how racial prejudice hides behind facades of politeness, professionalism, and equal opportunity. These invisible stereotypes, these anticipated judgments, were solid walls that stood in front of the dreams, ambitions, and efforts of people who, despite their talents, were considered less legitimate, less worthy. Malik was not just a director. He was a living example of the invisible barriers that racial prejudice created in spaces supposedly open to all. Her career, her qualifications, and her determination were just details in Ms. Leroy's eyes, compared to the image she had of what a leader should be: a white face, a well-groomed appearance, an unblemished background in an environment of privilege. What she didn't know, or refused to acknowledge, was that he was so much more than his current role. He embodied resistance against a system that had never made his life easier, a system that continued to perpetuate discrimination, even under the guise of fairness and inclusiveness. Before leaving the room, Malik turned to her one last time. The look he gave her was not one of anger, but of raw truth. "You didn't just reject a candidate, Ms. Leroy. You rejected the idea that people like me can hold these positions. You judged me on my appearance and not my skills." His words were harsh, but they were also charged with the dignity of a man who knew that humility was not synonymous with submission. Every syllable he spoke echoed centuries of injustice, but also generations of people ready to face this injustice with strength and resilience. He paused for a moment, measuring the impact of his words on the headmistress, observing how her eyes drowned in embarrassment and realization, but without letting the sight soften him. "But I assure you that next time, when we meet, it will be in a much more formal setting." He stared at her, his gaze piercing like a challenge, a promise that this encounter, although marked by unfair humiliation, would not be the last. "And this time, it will be you who will be held accountable." It was not an empty threat, but a certainty rooted in the deep respect he had for himself and for what he represented. The silence in the room after these words was almost palpable, heavy with meaning and implication. The director, although she was a woman of power, seemed helpless, trapped in the reality of the words she had just received. For a moment she tried to respond, but no words came. She knew that, right now, there was nothing to say. The truth had been thrown in her face, and the pain of her own ignorance was clearer than anything she could have articulated. With one last penetrating look, Malik turned on his heel and left the office. His step was measured, resolute. Head held high, heart firm. He left no room for doubts. This moment would mark a turning point in his career. The door behind him closed slowly, but he knew the echo of this confrontation would resonate far longer than that simple sound. He was no longer one candidate among many others. He was now a man who had broken the silence and unmasked the truth about how people like him were treated in spaces where they belonged just as much as anyone else. The company would have to face its own contradictions, and Malik was preparing to show them that success did not depend on the image that some wanted to convey, but on the real value of those they sought to discredit. The leaders of this company, as well as Ms. Leroy, were going to have to admit, sooner or later, that the values they advocated, inclusiveness, diversity, openness, could no longer be content to remain words on paper. They had to translate into real actions, bold decisions, and above all, deep and honest awareness. Malik knew that the road would not be easy, that this meeting would not erase the years of injustice he had experienced. But he was no longer ready to remain silent, to accept the place assigned to him by those who only saw him as an exception, a separate case. This moment, even if it did not guarantee anything, had marked a beginning. And he stood ready to move forward, with conviction and determination, to break down the walls of these false appearances and open the doors to a future where his place would not only be deserved, but obvious to all.